All right, so one of the things that we think about when we're building these tools is what information we actually need. So just because you can pull information doesn't necessarily mean that it's useful to building some of these student information tools. So over here on the left, I've got a list of stuff that we could pull out of our student database or student information system. But what we do before we build these tools is we think, what information do we really need, and what are we seeking in the end? So as we kind of run through this list, I would think about stuff that is going to help you accomplish your goals. So one of the things that we like to start with is student ID. That's going to be the easiest way for us to match up student information with the actual student. It's a lot easier to match a kid with a number than it is with a last name, simply because last names change in different systems. So for instance, if you had a double last name. So if my last name was Heilman space Deckham in one system, in another system, it might be Heilman hyphen Deckham. Another thing that I've seen happen is you've got, in some systems, an apostrophe, and in other systems they just completely get rid of the apostrophe. So since these can change depending on what system you are, it doesn't matter what system you're in, the student ID is always going to be the same for the student. So I would highly advise using student ID. You might still pull in last name and first name because we like to think of the students as kids as opposed to numbers. So that information is definitely good to have, but again, it's going to be easier to match up through student ID. With that said, you may or may not want to pull the student's middle initial. Most of the time, the middle initial is used to denote students that have the same name. Oh, I guess I should read my stuff over there. Smith, John. There we go. So you could have a John A. Smith and a John B. Smith. But remember, if we're already pulling student ID, is this another field that we really need? It might be nice to have, but it's also going to take up space and maybe add to overload of information. Additionally, I would argue that the address of the student is something that you don't necessarily need to pull. Most of the time, it's probably just easier to pull a parent email. That way, it's a quicker means of communication. Most of the time, we're not addressing letters, but if that's something that you want your tool to do, then that might be a piece of information that you'd want to pull. Since it tends to be rather long, it's really, I would advise against pulling it unless you actually need to. Parent's phone number, I mean, that you might need to pull that. One of the intervention databases that I've worked on, we pulled parent phone number, but another one that was just tracking student grades, no parent phone number was pulled. So the second option that I was talking about is more about just for the teacher to see how the student's progressing as opposed to contacting parents, which is why we didn't pull the phone number. Student's date of birth, again, might be helpful. Locker number, that's probably something that it's nice that we can pull, but we don't necessarily need if we're building an intervention database or a student grade database. You probably have the ability to pull all 4 quarters of grades, so you might want to pull those during the current year, and then at the very end just put the final grade in, and that's what transfers over to the next year. You may want to pull student ethnicity, their special education status, their LEP level or ESOL level. Language spoken at home, this would be one that I would argue that you might not want to pull. It might be nice to have if you're tracking how interventions work with students who have a different language than English spoken at home, but if that's not the case, then it's an overload of information. Same thing with teacher names. Again, it might be nice to have, but chances are if you have a student database or student information system, there's another way of getting the information, so we're not going to try to duplicate it here. Other scores that might have been listed for the student, you might actually also want to pull SOL data. So you can see that just because we have the ability to pull this information doesn't necessarily mean that we want to have that. We want to have data on the student. So we don't want to have an overload of information. So again, what I would do before you build these tools or work with any of this stuff is sit down and think about what you actually want the tool to do and help out, and then what information you need to get that job done. And that'll help you start to slash the trash out of what you don't need to pull for building these tools.